The morning my divorce was finalized, I didn't cry. I'd done all my crying in the shower at 2 a.m. for the past 6 months, and by the time the judge signed the papers, I felt like a wrung-out washcloth. Nothing left, but somehow still in one piece. I walked out of the courthouse in downtown Columbus with my lawyer beside me, and the first thing I did was check my phone. Not to call anyone. Not to process what had just happened. I checked to make sure our flight to Portland was still on time. It was, departing in 4 hours. My 2 kids were already at my sister's apartment across town, bags packed. My daughter was 8. My son had just turned 6. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they knew enough to know things were different now. They'd been different for a long time. My husband, my ex-husband, I had to start saying that. His name was Elliot. We'd been married for 9 years. I'd worked as a dental hygienist and put him through his MBA. I watched him build a financial consulting firm from a home office to a real downtown suite with 11 employees. I brought him lunch on his late nights. I covered for him when he missed a kid's recitals and school plays because a client needed him. I did all of that, and I told myself it was partnership. What I didn't know, what I found out on a random Tuesday in October when I came home early from a half day at work, was that partnership, apparently, went only one direction. Her name was Francesca. She worked in his building, 2 floors up for a marketing agency. She was 27. I was 33. He was 38. And when I walked into my kitchen that afternoon, she was sitting at my kitchen island in my husband's college sweatshirt, eating my yogurt, and looking at me with an expression that wasn't quite guilt. It was more like inconvenience. Like I'd interrupted something. Elliot came downstairs and didn't even flinch. He just looked at me and said, "I was going to tell you this weekend." That was 6 months ago. I want to be honest about those 6 months because I've heard stories like mine get told, as if the woman floated through the pain like it was a movie montage. It wasn't like that for me. I fell apart in ways I'm not proud of. I called him at midnight twice, begging him to just explain it to me. I lost 8 pounds I didn't have to lose. I sat in my kids' rooms after they fell asleep just to feel something steady. My daughter once found me crying at the kitchen table and brought me her stuffed rabbit without saying a word, and that broke me more than anything Elliot ever did. But I kept moving. That's the only way I know how to say it. I kept moving. My sister had been living in Portland for 4 years. She'd moved out there after her own fresh start, and she'd been calling me every Sunday since October saying the same thing, "Come out here, just come." Her apartment had 2 extra rooms. She'd already enrolled the kids in a nearby school. She'd already talked to her landlord. She'd done everything except physically put me in a car and drive me to the airport herself. The divorce settlement gave me full custody, the house to sell, and a fair share of the firm's value based on my contributions during the marriage. My lawyer, a woman named Kathleen, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, had made sure of that. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, and Kathleen documented every way I had financially and operationally supported Elliot during the years he built that business. The number that came out of that settlement made Elliot furious in a very specific, quiet way, the kind of fury that comes when someone finally holds up a mirror and you can't argue with your own reflection. He didn't fight for more custody time. That told me everything I needed to know about who he was choosing to be from here on out. So there I was, divorce papers signed, kids at my sister's, flight in 4 hours, and somewhere across the city, Elliot's parents, his sister, his brother-in-law, and his grandmother, 5 people who had once called me family, were gathered at a women's health clinic, waiting to find out how far along Francesca was. I knew they were there because his mother had accidentally sent a group text to the old family thread, the one I hadn't been removed from yet. It said, "So excited for today. New life. New chapter for our family." New life. I set my phone face down on the seat of my car and drove to pick up my kids. I need to explain something about Elliot's family because I don't think the story makes sense without it. His parents, particularly his mother, had one obsession that ran underneath everything else in that family: legacy. Specifically, a male heir. His father had built a regional real estate business over 30 years, and his mother had spent 3 decades talking about who would carry it on. Elliot had an older sister who'd married out of state and had 2 daughters. In his mother's very loud, very vocal opinion, that branch had closed. Everything landed on Elliot. Here's what made that painful in a way that still makes me angry. Elliot and I had a son. A perfectly healthy, bright, funny little boy who loved dinosaurs and could already do multiplication in his head at 6 years old. His name was Cooper. And Cooper was Elliot's son. There was never any question about that. But somehow, in that family's logic, Cooper didn't count anymore because Cooper was leaving with me. Because Cooper was my son more than he was theirs now. Because Elliot had chosen Francesca, and Francesca was pregnant, and a new baby, especially if it was a boy, was the fresh start the family needed. I heard his mother say this, not secondhand. I heard her say it on a phone call she didn't realize I could hear through the baby monitor app still connected to our home system. She said, "This is what the family needs, a real heir, a child raised in the family, not pulled away from it." Cooper was 6 years old, and his grandmother was already writing him off. I didn't say anything. I just went home, opened my laptop, and called Kathleen. The flight to Portland was smooth. My son fell asleep with his head on my arm before we even reached cruising altitude, and my daughter sat next to me reading a graphic novel and occasionally narrating plot points I hadn't asked about, which is her love language and one of my greatest joys. The sky outside went pink and then purple and then dark, and I felt, for the first time in months, like I could breathe without measuring it. My sister met us at the airport in a van she borrowed from a friend because she didn't have a back seat big enough for 2 car seats. She'd made a handwritten sign that said, "Welcome Heme, Team Hartley," and my daughter absolutely screamed when she saw it. My son woke up just long enough to say "Aunt Bex" and go immediately back to sleep on her shoulder. I let myself feel that. I let that be enough for that night. What I didn't know yet, what I was about to spend the next several weeks finding out, was that while I was in the air, things at that clinic had not gone the way Elliot's family expected. Francesca's ultrasound was at 2 in the afternoon. All 5 of them had shown up: Elliot, his mother, his father, his sister, and his grandmother, who was in her 80s and had apparently insisted on being there. The waiting room of a women's health clinic with 5 relatives of the father. I heard later that the front desk staff was visibly uncomfortable. The appointment ran long. That was the first sign. What came out of that room was not a celebration. The OB, a straightforward woman who'd been practicing for 20 years and had no patience for drama, told Elliot, in the presence of his family, that based on the ultrasound measurements, the conception date was approximately 2 weeks earlier than Elliot had told her was possible. He'd been on a 10-day work trip to Chicago during the window she was describing. Elliot started doing math out loud in the hallway. Francesca started crying. Not the grateful, overwhelmed kind, the other kind. His mother's handmade baby's first card, which I only know about because his sister texted a photo of it to a mutual friend in what I can only assume was a moment of stunned disbelief, stayed in her purse. I found out about all of this in pieces, over the following days, through the kind of social osmosis that happens in a small network of people who've known each other for years. A former neighbor. A college friend who still worked near Elliot's office. His sister who called me about 2 weeks after I'd landed in Portland and started the conversation with a long silence and then, "I owe you an apology." I sat down when she said that. I hadn't expected it. She told me what had happened in that hallway. She told me that Elliot had demanded a paternity test before the baby was even born, that Francesca had initially refused, and that his parents had spent a week alternating between defending Francesca and screaming at Elliot behind closed doors. She told me his grandmother had stopped speaking to everyone involved and gone to stay with a cousin in Scottsdale. She told me his father had quietly started asking their estate attorney questions about how assets were structured. "He's a mess," she said, "and I know that probably doesn't fix anything for you." "It doesn't," I said, "but I appreciate you calling." She asked about the kids. I told her Cooper had already made 2 friends at his new school and had a dinosaur birthday party in the works. I told her my daughter had joined an art club. She cried a little. I didn't. What happened next took about 3 months to fully come together, but Kathleen had actually planted the seed for it back in Columbus. When we were going through the financials during the divorce, something had flagged in the records. A series of transfers from the business account that didn't line up with any client invoices or documented expenses. Kathleen brought it to my attention, and I told her to pursue it. At the time, I hadn't known exactly what it meant. I just knew that 9 years of watching that business get built had given me a working knowledge of how it was supposed to run, and something wasn't right. It turned out Elliot had been running personal expenses through the company for years. Not dramatically at first. Meals, some travel, a few gifts. But it had escalated. A significant portion of what he and Francesca had spent together over the prior 18 months had been run through the firm as client entertainment and business development. We're talking about $47,000 over that period. The IRS does not find this charming. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't have to. The discrepancy had come up in the divorce financial disclosures, which are public record, and someone I genuinely do not know who brought it to the right attention. By the time spring came, Elliot was dealing with a federal audit of his firm. His 11 employees had a very uncertain few months. His parents, who had invested in the business in its early years, were suddenly very interested in where their money had gone. Francesca's prenatal DNA test, which she'd finally agreed to after Elliot threatened to legally challenge paternity, came back and confirmed what the ultrasound dates had suggested. Elliot was not the father. I want to be careful here because I'm not going to say I felt joy about any specific part of what happened to them. That's not honest. What I felt was a complicated, exhausted kind of relief. The specific relief of someone who spent years wondering if they were imagining things, and then found out they weren't imagining anything. The chaos wasn't proof that I was right and they were wrong, but it was proof that the version of reality I'd been living in, the one where I worked hard and trusted people and held things together, was real. It happened. It mattered. And I had already left. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't stay to watch it fall apart. I didn't plot. I didn't plan revenge. I made a decision to take my kids to Portland and build something new, and I did it, and the rest of it happened on its own. Portland in spring is something I wasn't prepared for. I'd visited my sister before, but always in summer or fall. I didn't know about the cherry blossoms. I didn't know about the Saturday farmers markets that go for 6 blocks. I didn't know that my daughter would fall in love with a ceramics class, or that my son would decide he wanted to learn to ride a skateboard, and would be genuinely good at it by May. I found a dental hygienist position at a practice about 8 minutes from my sister's place. The hours worked around school pickup. The dentist I worked for had 2 kids of her own and a zero-drama policy about schedule flexibility for parents, which I found out on my first day and almost wept at. My sister and I started cooking dinner together most nights, which is something we hadn't done since we were teenagers. She'd put on music and the kids would wander in and out and eventually end up sitting on the kitchen counter eating crackers and watching us argue about whether the pasta needed more garlic. It was ordinary in a way that felt almost sacred after the year I'd had. I'm not going to tell you I wasn't lonely sometimes. I was. There were nights after the kids were asleep when the apartment was too quiet and I'd sit by the window and feel the weight of being the only adult responsible for all of it. The permission slips, the insurance renewals, the moment my son woke up at midnight convinced there was a spider on the ceiling. All of it, solo. That's real. But there's a different quality to that loneliness. It doesn't have the undertow. It doesn't drag you down the way loneliness does when you're technically with someone who's already gone. About 5 months after we arrived in Portland, I got a call from Elliot's mother. Not a text, a call. I almost didn't answer. She started by asking how the children were. I told her they were good. She asked if they missed Ohio. I told her they were adjusting. And then she said the thing she'd actually called to say. She wanted to know if there was any possibility, any at all, of a different custody arrangement. Not because of anything I'd done wrong. She was clear about that. But because Elliot was going to be occupied with business things for the foreseeable future, and the family was concerned that the children were growing up too far away. I held the phone for a moment. Your grandson made the honor roll last month, I said, and your granddaughter just had her ceramics piece accepted into her school's art show. They're both happy and they're both healthy. She was quiet. They have my number, I said. And so do you. That hasn't changed. She said thank you. She hung up. We haven't spoken since. Kathleen called me in July to let me know the audit had resulted in significant penalties for Elliot and that the firm had lost two major clients in the fallout. The business his father had partially invested in, the one his mother had spent 3 decades planning a dynasty around, was operating at a fraction of its former capacity. Whether it survived was, Kathleen said, genuinely unclear. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired and a little sad, in the way you feel sad about a fire in a building you used to love. Even when you know the building had been rotting from the inside for years. What I felt truly good about, genuinely, cleanly good, was different. It was the September morning when I dropped both kids off at school and drove to work with the windows down and realized I wasn't dreading anything. Not the day, not the week, not the phone ringing. I wasn't waiting for something to be taken from me or something to go wrong. I was just driving to work with the windows down on a September morning in Portland. That might sound small. It isn't. There's a version of this story where I ended by telling you I found someone new, or that Elliot came crawling back, or that his mother sent a tearful apology letter. None of that happened. Maybe some version of it will eventually. I don't spend much time wondering. What I can tell you is this. The night my divorce was finalized, I walked out of a courthouse and checked my flight time. I picked up my kids. I got on a plane. And I chose, very deliberately, to put my energy into the life that was waiting for me instead of the one that had already ended. My daughter still has the stuffed rabbit she handed me at the kitchen table. That night I was crying. It lives on her bookshelf now. She named it something I can't remember, and doesn't think is particularly significant, but every time I walk past her room and see it, I think about how a 6-year-old child knew exactly what to do when someone she loved was hurting. She just showed up and offered what she had. That's the whole lesson, really. That's all of it. You figure out who you are when someone treats you like you're nothing. And if you're lucky, if you do the hard work of not letting their version of you become your version of yourself. You walk out of that courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon, and you check your flight time, and you go get your kids, and you just go. There's something I keep thinking about, even now, not about Elliot, not about Francesca, or the clinic, or the audit. I think about Cooper handing me his stuffed rabbit at the kitchen table. She didn't say anything. She just walked over and held it out, the way kids do when they know something is broken and they don't have the words yet. So they offer what they have. That's what integrity looks like before it has a name, before anyone teaches it to you. You just show up and you give what you've got. I've spent a long time wondering what went wrong in my marriage, and I think part of the honest answer is that I confused loyalty with silence. I kept the peace. I covered for him. I told myself that was strength. But there's a difference between being steady and being invisible, and somewhere along the way, I let the line between those two things blur completely. The choices I made, staying quiet, absorbing the gaps, believing it would course correct on its own, had consequences. Not because I was weak, but because I wasn't paying attention to what my own judgment was telling me. I knew things were off years before I admitted it out loud. That knowledge was always there. I just kept talking myself out of trusting it. What I understand now is that clear thinking is its own form of protection. When Kathleen flagged those financial discrepancies, she wasn't doing anything dramatic. She was just paying attention and following the thread where it led. That's all intelligence really is in practice. Not brilliance, not strategy, just the discipline to look at what's actually in front of you instead of what you wish was there. I'd spent 9 years looking away. Once I stopped, everything became a lot simpler, even when it was hard. And then there's the part that doesn't get talked about enough, which is how long it takes. The leaving isn't one moment. It's 100 small decisions that nobody sees. Getting up when you don't want to, filing the paperwork, showing up to a new city with 2 kids and a job you just accepted over the phone, and a sister who borrowed a van because her car didn't have enough seats. None of that is glamorous. There was no version of those months that felt triumphant while I was inside them. I was just moving, one day and then the next. Elliot's family spent years building something around the wrong things, around control and inheritance and the idea that legacy is something you engineer rather than something you earn. And when it came apart, It came apart completely because there was nothing underneath it that was actually real. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just what happens when the foundation is hollow. Weight reveals weakness. Life applies the weight. What I rebuilt in Portland is smaller and quieter than what I left behind in Columbus. But every part of it is load-bearing. That's the difference. My kids are happy. My work is honest. My sister and I argue about garlic, and it turns out that is enough. It is genuinely, completely enough. I think about Cooper with that rabbit sometimes, and I think that's who I want to be. Someone who shows up when it's hard, offers what they have, and doesn't need the situation to be less painful before they decide to help. That's the whole education, really. Everything else is just practice.